Anna James is a freelance writer and journalist. After working as a secondary school librarian, she became book news editor for the Bookseller magazine before moving to freelance in 2015. Her debut children's book, Pages & Co. Tilly and the Book Wanderers, was HarperCollins' children's flagship debut of 2018. The second in the series, Pages & Co. Tilly and the Lost Fairy Tales, has recently been published, and Anna met with Nikki Gamble to talk about her work and what happens next.
There can be nothing more exciting than welcoming a fellow book enthusiast, but also somebody who has worked as a school librarian, which I know many of our listeners will appreciate. So Anna, I wonder if we could start by talking a little bit about your background and your relationship with books and reading.
Of course. It's hard to sort of go back and trace a beginning because books and reading have just always been woven through my life pretty inextricably. So it's always been there. I've always been a huge reader. Books for me were very much an escape. I grew up in the countryside, also in a very religious family, and books for me were a way of just exploring a wider world that I didn't really have a great deal of access to or understanding of. And libraries have, again, always just been a huge part of my life. I can remember finishing the reading scheme in year 2, and I was very competitive with my best friend about who was going to read it, because when you finish the reading scheme you were allowed to go and choose your own book from the library, which I've been very fortunate. All the schools I went to had excellent school libraries, and I can remember the feeling of finishing that last book and being sent to the library by myself and walking into what I know in my adult brain must have been a cupboard with books in, but I can remember walking in and just seeing these shelves, and honestly in my memory they stretched up infinitely, and just feeling like I had the entire world at my fingertips. And I think that really that was the start of so much of my relationship with books and becoming a librarian and then becoming a writer. So yeah, libraries and books just always been there. And then I became a school librarian, which was just the most rewarding job, and then a books journalist, and I've done a bit of literary scouting, and just all my jobs have been to do with books and reading.
When you were a school librarian, it was secondary school,
yes,
right up to sixth form.
Yeah.
What insights did that give you from working so closely with young readers?
I think above all, it's a lack of snobbery and an approach to reading that's focused on just wanting children and young readers to love it, and that's a different path for every reader, and that there's not a right or a wrong way to do it. There's not right or wrong books. I don't think you can work with children or teenagers and really have any place to sort of be sort of judgmental about books. You know, if Twilight is the book that gets someone into books, then that's fab, and there's no need to sort of sit down and talk to them about how the, you know, feminism in Twilight is a little bit dodgy. You know, there's a time and a place for that later. So I think that above all, it's just embracing whatever path a child takes to becoming a reader. It's your job to kind of facilitate that and to support it, not to kind of shove them onto a different path.
There's a difference, isn't there, between being non-judgmental and being that guide or that person that recommends.
Oh, absolutely. It's such a privilege as a school librarian to get to help guide a reader, and the satisfaction of matching a reader to a book that really speaks to them. There's nothing like it. And the moments of satisfaction when a child would come back after a weekend and bring a book back and they've devoured it and they loved it, and especially when it's the book that changes their relationship to reading and turns them into a reader. There's nothing like it.
I think that's possibly why a really good librarian has such a special bond with a reader. It does go beyond the books. There's that connection, isn't
Absolutely.
there?
I'm still in touch with students that I worked with, and there's one student that still just messages me. She still calls me Miss, and she'll just tell me that she's read something. And she messaged me, and she was just like, "Oh, Miss, have you heard of this author called Jojo Moyes?" And just the fact that she still wants to tell me that she's read something she loved is just lovely. It makes me very happy.
Who was that for you?
My granddad had a big impact, and he obviously wasn't in that teacher librarian role, but he was hugely impactful in terms of my relationship with books, and he always encouraged my sister and I to read widely, and he helped us choose a lot of books, and he used to go to the independent bookstore where he was, and he would tell them what we'd been enjoying and they'd recommend him what we should read next. In terms of librarians, it's more like a kind of nebulous collection of lots of librarians rather than one specific person. As I said, I was very lucky that my schools always had libraries, and my high school had an amazing librarian who was she probably had the biggest impact on me. I think she was very happy to have a keen reader to recommend things to. She recommended me The Time Traveller's Wife, which is one of my favourite books, and I feel like it's one of those books that has become so popular that people sometimes are a bit snotty about saying that you love it, but I love it. And it was recommended to me by my school librarian, and I remember going into school and she was so excited to give it to me, and it had just come out, and she was like, I have got a book that you are going to love. And she was right. And that power of someone just taking the time to know you and your taste and to be excited to recommend you books.
Which is a great point for bringing in your own writing, because actually you can see some connection with Time Traveller's Wife in a way.
Know what? I've literally never made that connection before, but of course massively you're right. That's so funny, isn't it, the way that we read these books and they just become part of you.
Like, and I wouldn't have made that connection. It's just listening to you talk about that and thinking, no, I can see
I've never consciously made that connection, but you are entirely right. You're entirely right that is a book that is a huge part of my life and writing consciousness, and I've not done that on purpose, but you're so right.
They're somewhere in the kind of labyrinth.
And like Bee's storyline is, wow, I need to like go and think about that and how I've subconsciously done that. That's the whole thing I need to go and spend time thinking about.
How fascinating. Tell us a little bit then about book wandering and where that came from.
I have tried to pinpoint a specific moment, and I'm not sure that there was one particular moment. There was a lot of things. When I worked at the Bookseller magazine for a couple of years, and when you work in publishing, people constantly ask you if you want to write a book. And honestly, that wasn't the goal. I felt incredibly creatively satisfied by writing as a journalist and reviewing other people's books and recommending books to people. But I sort of had a few ideas that are constantly kind of floating around my head. There was the idea of wanting to write a book set in a bookshop and that kind of community idea. And then there was the idea of just the way we talk, when you work in books, you hear a lot about, language around getting lost in a good book, plot holes, like losing sense of time when you're reading. And I just love the idea of making that literal and what that might look like. And then the kind of final thing, which I suppose was the thing that tipped it over into me wanting to write as a real book, was thinking about if I could meet Anne Shirley, what I would say to her. And initially I thought it was maybe an essay or a short story, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought maybe there was more there.
And obviously in the first book we do meet Anne of Green Gables, Anne Shirley, and also Alice in Wonderland. And what were you introducing us to your favourite childhood books?
It's a mix of my favourite characters and characters that I felt were right for Tilly's story. Anne is I love her. She was such a formative character for me, and it was never an option to not have her there. Also, she's such a brilliant character. I was a bit nervous about writing, all of these characters I was nervous about writing as them, and taking these kind of beloved characters and giving them new lines and stories, and I hope that people feel like I've been true to their kind of essence, as it were. Alice was a mix of, I loved Alice in Wonderland, but Alice works really well because the story is so familiar to readers, because obviously a lot of the books I'm using, I didn't want to assume that younger readers knew the stories, whereas Alice, I think you can assume a little bit of familiarity, which means it was a really good way to basically explain the mechanics of book wandering, because I wasn't also having to explain the context of the world they were in, which you have to do a little bit with the other books. So if you say they go to the Mad Hatter's tea party, you don't then have to spend the time kind of setting up who those characters are and what's happening. You can use it to explain how book wandering works. Also, just it's a gift in terms of the scenes and the characters to play with. So yeah, a real mix. A Little Princess is a book that meant a lot to me as a child, and then Treasure Island was one that was, honestly, the first draft, they went to The Wind in the Willows at that point. and they had a picnic with Ratty and Mole, but my editor absolutely correctly pointed out that there was absolutely no plot or peril. And I say book wandering is dangerous, but at no point was it particularly dangerous. So my editor encouraged me to try and think of another scene that maybe would work better. So I used Treasure Island because I love the Muppet version of the book, and I enjoyed the book as a child as well. I enjoyed going back to it, and then actually that ended up being one of my favourite scenes to write, and it was really fun to write something that was a bit scarier and darker and pirates and long and silver. Although embarrassingly, when the proofs went out, a writer friend messaged me and said, I don't want to be this person, but I think that there is a small error in the Treasure Island scene. And I realised it's because I was referencing the Muppet film, not the book. Not the whole way through, but there was one character that I put somewhere, which is where they are in the Muppet film, but not in the book. I probably shouldn't admit to that, but I really love the Muppets.
No, I think it's important to recognise that.
More than one error around the Muppets, because I also I've edited an anthology of Christmas extracts for the British Library, and A Christmas Carol is in there, and I wrote a little introduction to all of the extracts, and again made reference to something that turns out to be in the Muppet film, not the book. So it's apparently a real issue I have.
No, but that's, there's a point there that our relationship with classics comes from something that is much deeper culturally than just having read the book.
Absolutely. And again, and a lot of that comes back to like a lack of snobbery as well. They're all stories and they're there to be enjoyed, and how you come to it doesn't matter. I really just don't think there's any place for kind of worrying that a child has come to Treasure Island through the Muppet film rather than they've sat down and read the book. They will probably, if they like the film, they'll then go to the book. It's all story.
And I'm sure some of them, the Alice that you've talked about, it will be the Disney that is the thing that's fixed in their head. That's really interesting. It's a contentious one, Treasure Island, isn't it? It's an exciting one once you get into the book. You have to get past all that introduction.
It wasn't a favourite when I was a child. I definitely erred towards kind of more whimsical books about girls, in tough life situations. Anna Green Gables, Little Princess, that was very much my sweet spot when I was reading, and I enjoyed Treasure Island a great deal more as a teenager than I did as a... I mean, classics sometimes, they were written a long time ago. Sometimes they weren't even written for children in the first place. And again, there's never any obligation for a child or anyone to read anything that they don't like. There's no point forcing someone to sit and read Treasure Island if they don't like it.
No, that's true. I wonder if we can just hop over to fairy tales for a moment. Your second book about the lost fairy tales. The mechanics of this I was absolutely fascinated in, the whole kind of setup for why a fairy tale is particularly dangerous to travel to. That's amazing.
Oh, thank you. It was fun to play with. So the idea in book wandering generally is that there are source editions, and that kind of keeps the books stable for when you're book wandering, because there is a authoritative version of most stories. But of course, fairy tales, they don't have that one authoritative set version, and they have come from an oral culture, and we have lots of different versions of several of them, and they've evolved. And I enjoyed thinking about, well, what impact would that have on book wandering? And so the idea is that they're much less stable because there are lots of different versions. They don't have that one authoritative copy. And so that means that stories can be dangerous, they can slide sort of on top of each other. There's lots of different versions of the characters that exist, and just lots of fun to think about the impact of where fairy tales have come from and how that might impact book wandering in them.
I have to say, I did think that was a really great idea.
Oh, thank you.
And I wanted to ask you what your favourite fairy tales were as a child, and whether you have a different favourite as an adult.
Because I do think inevitably reading fairy tales as an adult, especially through a sort of 2019 and a feminist lens, it's a different experience. Though my favourites are, it's sort of the same one. So my favourite when I was a child was the 12 Dancing Princesses. I loved it so much. And I think that, like, honestly, still that element of sisterhood was powerful, but also, the dressing up and the dancing, and the forests were really stuck in my head, that go through the different forests of gold and diamonds, and just finding that secret party. And I just thought that was magical. But obviously there are some issues in terms of just, they're essentially being bartered off by their father and whoever solves it, you know, and the idea that they shouldn't be doing that and they want to be kept, you know. But my favourite fairy tale now is Jessie Burton's version of that story. So Jessie Burton wrote a book called The Restless Girls, and it's just perfect. I honestly just burst into tears at the end reading it, because it took this story that I loved so much as a child, but that has some kind of weird elements from a 2019 perspective, and it kept the essence of the story but turned it into this just magical thing about sisterhood and the power of sort of your own voice and standing up for yourself. And it kept all the whimsy and the loveliness, but it twisted the things that are hard to read now, and I loved it. And oh my goodness, the illustrator is Angela Barrett, and part of the reason I had this really visceral response looking at the illustrations. There's on the proof cover, there's the shoes down the front, and I sent a picture to my little sister, and I was like, doesn't this just make you think of the books that we used to read together, and like we used to comb through and we'd pick out, oh, I'd wear those shoes, I'd wear that dress. And I had a very visceral response to it, and then I realised that it's because I had this book that I still have my childhood copy of. It was a book that my granddad bought me, and it's an illustrated book of stories from the ballet, and she'd illustrated it. And that was why I was having such an emotional response to it. It's because literally it was her illustrations of shoes and dresses that I had combed through with my little sister when I was a child.
A lovely story.
And then now, and I got to interview them together at an event, and I got her to sign my original copy of the book. I was so overwhelmed, but it just shows the power of these stories have on you.
I suppose what I'm interested in is that, and it's great that you've picked one story that you responded to as a child and as an adult in a different way. If they keep changing, what is it in their essence that makes them last?
It's such an interesting question, and I'm not sure it's one I have a particularly sort of articulate answer to. There's clearly something in them that speaks to us, because even the original stories, rife as they are with problematic stuff, they still speak to people. I do think that there's something to be said for those kind of archetypal characters and stories of overcoming difficulty. But I think for me it's that kind of sense of whimsy and magic. That's what captured me. I don't know, I do think perhaps it is slightly different from everybody, and perhaps why that they endure is because they have a bit of everything that makes stories magical. And so whether you love adventures or whimsy or whatever it is about stories that you love, there are probably fairy tales that have that as well. They kind of become these universal stories, and I think also the concept of them is so appealing, even more than the specifics of the story, and we associate them with reading. We often have very fun, like, you know, talking about the 12 Dancing Princesses. For me, it's so linked to reading books with my family and my sister, and it's a lot to do with memory and the way you read and encounter stories. I think that we're responding to as much as the stories themselves. Sometimes when you go back and read the stories, they're not that magical on a word sort of sentence by sentence level, but there is something about the magic and the whimsy and the adventure of them. I think also that often, I think this is a lot of why children's fiction is exciting still to read as an adult. A lot of the time they're about characters who sort of stumble upon adventure, and I do think there is certainly a bit of me, and I think a lot of most people, certainly readers, who still kind of live in the hope that you might stumble across an adventure.
And the underdog often wins out, which is very appealing to us, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And I guess they're very economical.
I do think it's the ideas and not the actual stories on a sentence by sentence level that are what we respond to.
Yeah. I don't know whether, as somebody that has been a journalist and knows children's books really well, whether you feel that when we see fairy tales being reproduced for children, that it's the same tales over and over again, and that somehow that wealth of fairy tale literature just isn't mined for children in the way that it could be.
I'm not sure. I think that you do see fairy tales surfacing again and again, and I do think it's mined in almost every children's book, even if it's not an explicit retelling. I think that fairy tales are so much a part of the foundation of the way that we understand storytelling as readers and writers, that you kind of can't not. We were talking about the way that I have subconsciously used The Time Traveller's Wife. Everything we read is in us, even if we're not consciously using it. And I think fairy tales are so much part of our culture and our society and our reading that even if you're not consciously using them, you probably are subconsciously using them.
Interesting. I'd like to ask you a few things about yourself as a writer now. What for you is the most pleasurable part of the process?
It's the part at the start where you have this idea and you haven't started having to write it down yet. Laini Taylor said that having an idea for a book is like seeing a butterfly, and then writing it is like hammering it to a page. And then I once said that to Ali Smith, and she said that how you have to think about it is that having an idea is seeing a butterfly and holding it in your hands for a few moments and then letting it go, which is just a beautiful way. So I tried to think of it like that, but there is this moment where you're kind of researching and thinking about it, and you have the idea for the book, and it still feels like it could be perfect because you haven't started trying to translate it into words, and that is such an exciting part of it. And then the other best bit is when it's done and you get to speak to children and readers about it. So like everything apart from the actual writing of it, but that's not really fair. I do enjoy most of the writing.
So the opposite question to that is, which is the bit that is most challenging for you?
I am not a natural planner, and I find the wrangling of the plot specifics sometimes challenging, especially in a series, because you inherit, I'm writing book 3 at the moment, and there's just I've amassed a level of world building and magic and rules that I'm having to negotiate, and wishing I was like a J.K. Rowling who has those like incredibly in-depth like plans for the whole series, and wishing I wish I'd done that. So I do sometimes get tangled in plot and trying to make sure that it works, and getting the right balance between not making it too convoluted, which is definitely where I tend towards, but also that it can't just be simple. That's probably the bit I find hardest. I really enjoy editing. I find it very satisfying, the process of like making it better.
Have you found any techniques that have helped with the plotting that you've...
I mean, the honest answer is no. The honest answer is the biggest help is my editor. I tweeted relatively a while ago when I was starting to do the book 3, and said how do people plan stuff, and lots of writers are incredibly kind and sent me their spreadsheets and how they do it, but none of them work for me. And I do think when you get asked for writing advice, honestly, I do think embracing how you naturally do it is important, and that if you're not excited and enthused by the idea of doing a spreadsheet, don't force yourself to do a spreadsheet. So the thing actually is that I just make peace with the fact that it's something it doesn't necessarily come naturally to me, and it's going to be something I'm going to have to work out, and that I have editors and an agent who are brilliant, and I can talk things through with, and that it doesn't have to be perfect straight away.
We're not all the same. People find aspects of it easy and aspects of it difficult. And of course the other thing that you have done quite a lot of is interview writers in your time.
Yes.
And that's a real privilege too, isn't it? It's like having a masterclass every time. Like I'm having a masterclass right now talking to you.
No.
So what have you garnered from the opportunity to talk to so many writers?
I think not so much specific tips as much as sometimes it's just really lovely and reassuring to just get to speak to a writer and realise that, I interviewed Ali Smith, and just realising that she grapples with the same things that everyone else does is really reassuring. I'd say interviewing Ali was probably the interview that had the biggest impact, although her advice was not helpful because she's Ali Smith, so she was like, just tell your editor if you need more time, you can be however late you need to be. And whilst there is flexibility always with everyone, obviously if you're Ali Smith you probably have a little bit more flexibility, But just talking through it's just so interesting. Rather than learning sort of specific things, I just find it fascinating to get to speak to writers and writers I admire about how they approach writing. And it just reminds you of the power of fiction as well. When you get to do an event I interviewed Stephen Chbosky the other week at Perks of Being a Wallflower, and to get to speak to him in front of a room full of people who his book has literally changed their life, to get to see that relationship in practice and to get to speak to him about creating something like that, it all comes down to just the potential power that stories have.
And I think perhaps that's the best advice we can pass on to our listeners who are working with young children day in and day out. Everybody does it differently.
Absolutely.
And that's fantastic.
There's not a right or a wrong way to be a writer or a reader.
Yeah. Anna, it's been such a privilege talking to you today.
Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for joining us in the Reading Corner.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.